All right, Sam. Like we talked back and forth before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
My name's Sam. I'm a physio and movement coach based in Sydney. I currently work at a clinic called Proform. You would have had Dan, who also works at Proform, on a little while ago now, probably about 2 years. My main interest, I guess, as a physio is on movement coaching. I think that's where I've kind of seen my career develop a little bit as I've gone along, and in particular, it's around football or soccer, whichever one you want to call it. Um, and yeah, I believe we're going to be talking a bit about Franz Bosch and dynamic systems theory today, which again is a little bit or has had a big influence, I guess, on my principles as a physio. Recently, I had the privilege of working with the Solomon Islands national futsal team, which was a cool experience, and I got to implement some of this stuff and really see the value of it, not just from a team perspective, but also honing in on individuals and the potential injuries that they were getting, and that normal physiotherapy, if you want to call it that, was just not really cutting it for them. So that was cool, and I've had a ton of injuries myself. It's always a big thing for field sport athletes, and even using some of this stuff and applying it to myself has been massive. So I guess the takeaway is that yeah, that really forms the basis of me as a physio.
Cool, cool. So, what got you into like the France Bosch system at the first place?
Yeah, so it's big at our clinic. A few of the guys did it quite a while ago, and when I first joined, I was exposed to it a little bit. I did the course a couple of years ago now, and that kind of immersed me completely in a lot of his work, and also, the dynamic system theory as a whole, because it's been around for a while, and we know about Bernstein. He was around a long time ago now, so all of this stuff and ecology and those sorts of principles have been around a long time. But yeah, it certainly the past few years, I've developed a real interest in it, kind of looking at it unfold as I've immersed myself more in it. But certainly working at Proform has helped develop that.
Cool. So, I know a lot of like, I don't know why, like, recently there's a lot of like physical therapists message me about this. So, are a physical therapist. You're like physical therapists are better than coaches at movement. So, in France, Bosch's book, while he tried to like say like find a tractor or fluctuator, it makes sense to me like in a movement standpoint, but like I know it's at some like some situation kind of like it's a little bit different than what we used to know at like traditional strength and conditioning. Or people might say it's kind of like not, it's kind of different than biomechanic, which I kind of like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's different to biomechanics. I would say, it's a landscape really, and it encompasses all of those things. And you look through Franz's book, and he talked about biomechanics principles. He might put a different label on them necessarily to some of the other prominent coaches around. I know that the Altus guys definitely have different ways of talking about this stuff, but essentially, it's just principles that really feed into biomechanics. And I think what's great about it is it takes into account, obviously, that when we're looking at an athlete, in particular a field sport athlete, and how chaotic that environment is, it can kind of give us a better understanding and a more broad view of what we're looking at, not just what this individual muscle is doing, but how that fits into the context of their movement. And so when we're looking at attractors and fluctuators, I think the easiest way that I've found to kind of try and understand it is, I'm not sure whether you've seen that the sort of 4D landscape that Franz describes, where there's the wells and the flat bits and that sort of thing. And I think the easiest way to describe it is as we're moving around the field and trying to come across our opponents and dodge them or whatever we're trying to do. We're trying to find those attractor wells as often as we can in our movement in particular. And if we do that, not only are we able to be better at our performance, but we're also reducing the risk of injury because we're utilizing all of our body's artillery essentially. And then your fluctuators would be the flat bits in between them, which are necessary because if we were in stable wells all the time, we wouldn't go anywhere. So it's probably the easiest way to think about it in that sense, I think. And you touch on a point a little bit inadvertently. These theories and things are very detailed, and some of them are often quite abstract. And I think we're lucky that Bosch has done this because I know looking through the back of some of his books and how much of the research papers he's read and tried to digest, they're very complicated. So probably my advice to anybody, any physios, would be to try and keep it as simple as possible when you're applying
I literally like need to like read it like 3 times so I can understand it.
it. Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
It, sorry, I was going to say it's just a more of a broad view, maybe perhaps at the beginning, and then yeah, you hone in as you go. And I have found that the more that I have read it myself, it you pick up something different each time. So I would agree.
Yeah, yeah. So, I know the newest book, Anatomy of Agility, talks about like how to find a tractor, but still, I can walk us through how would you find these attractor?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. There's the official way that Franz talked about in the in the book, sorry. There's rules for finding a tractor specifically. I think there's 7 or so that he outlines. I do think that as a physio or indeed an S&C coach, because the reality is S&C coaches also have an excellent understanding of movement, especially some of the ones who have been in the game for a really long time. So we can't discredit that. You can also look at the athlete in front of you and actually kind of see where some stable positions around joints might be just from your subjective viewing of it. But if we really want to dive into all 7 of the rules, I can do that briefly for you. So the first one is if there's time pressure, and that's obviously very, very prominent when we're dealing with somebody on a sporting field, or indeed any sort of rapid movement, even in the running cycle as well. Our body, and our brain more specifically, are just not equipped enough to be able to calculate these things and coordinate every single part of the movement on its own. And so you might have read in the book that bottom-up approach that Franz talks about. If we don't have that and we don't have these preflexes and co-contractions, which lead to our attractor states, then we're not going to be able to deal with that time pressure and create stability around joints, and overall improving performance. So that's the first key one. And I do find that one I look at quite often. I think when you video an athlete changing direction or running, you can really see how well they're dealing with, changes in instructions or tasks that they might have to adapt to, and whether they're actually getting into these attractor states well or not. The next one's large impinging forces. So as we know, there's about 5 to 7 times your body weight that goes through the joints as we run. Yeah, and that is obviously a bit more in the sprinting side of things, but that's a massive amount of force that goes through your body. And so for us to be able to deal with those forces and also propel on to the next step or change direction, we need to be able to deal with these really well. And so things like swing leg retraction and hip lock, just to name a few, I'm sure we'll talk about some more of those later, are very important stable positions that are able to deal with impinging forces. And I think thinking about the torque principle as well, if we're not limiting the amount of torque that we need to deal with, and that's what these attractor states do really well, that's going to be very hard for us to actually overcome them. So that's a really important one. And then obviously if the direction of the force changes greatly, that kind of links in a little bit to the time pressure point of view. If we have that change of direction, then I know in the book he talks a bit about, and he uses the leg as an example. If we have the forces coming from different directions, essentially what we want is the resultant force to be able to deal with those really, really well. And so whether that be more of a quad dominant contraction with the hamstring supporting or the opposite way, we need those muscles to be working in unison to be able to deal with that. The next one around at-risk structures. So I think this principle perhaps promotes a little bit of that fragility thing, which as physios, we don't want to promote so much. I don't want people to start to think that their back is really fragile and can't be loaded, or their ankle is really fragile on a netball court, for example, and can't be loaded. It's really just when we're at a particular position or body posture where the force that's getting imposed on it is too great to deal with. And so, for example, a cricketer who's fast bowling, I know Harry talked about this a little bit on your podcast last time, but that particular area is at risk to injuries if not dealt with correctly. So that would be a type of area that we'd be looking at, trying to develop attractors. Changes in muscle activity, we kind of touched on that a little bit, depending on where the force goes, depends on which muscle we need to deal with. Reflexive patterns, these ones kind of sort themselves out, right? They're built-in patterns. I think we can enhance them with our training, and especially the constraints-led approach can certainly enhance how these reflexive patterns work. But they are in the end built in. And then finally, this is my favorite one, and one I actually do actively talk to my patients a lot about is endpoints. So we need to be thinking about in these patterns of movement where a stable endpoint might need to be. And I've had a few interesting examples recently, even with a break dancer of mine who I've been treating for the last little while. I was going through some of this stuff with him when he was struggling a little bit to create stability around his wrist as he was doing the head spins and all that sort of fun stuff. So yeah, it's the probably for me the one that I actually use the most when I'm discussing them with the patients, and it seems to be the one that gets understood the easiest. As we know, this is a bit of an abstract sort of principle. So for any physios out there, I'd be talking to your patients about this stuff in particular. But yeah, those are your rules, I guess.
Nice, nice, nice. So I know that a lot of like let's say team-based team sport athlete, if they need to use it, they're probably gonna use like hip lock or like a swing leg retraction, right? So um in their system they kind of don't like to like lift weight. They kind of want like to focus on movement, focus on like you mentioned, like movement at the end point. Um, is that a thing that really like would train it like with uh these methods? Is it really gonna be able to transfer to what they do on the sport?
Yeah, so I think in terms of weights, I don't think that they're asking us to shy away from it. And of course, there are certain sports where weights are literally what you need to use in powerlifting and in Olympic lifting and that sort of thing. And certainly we can touch on Olympic lifting in a second. But I don't think that we should be shying away from using weights. What I do think is, and Franz talks about this as well, is that when we start to get into more of the hypertrophy type training, that's when we don't have a good influence on the muscle structure and the way that we use the muscles, and it doesn't transfer very well when we go out onto the field. We don't need big muscles to be able to run fast necessarily. I know that was perhaps at one point or another in history the thought process, but we don't necessarily need that. We just need to be able to express force really well. So you may use weights to actually try and enhance some of these things. And if we're thinking about the force velocity curve, we know that right at the top of the curve, you actually do need quite a lot of weight and external force. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to train that particular part of it. So I suppose how I implement some of this stuff might not be as strict and pure as some people might implement it. I know Harry, that's primarily what he does. And I think as maybe as my understanding of this stuff evolves over time, that might change. But for now, I think I do like to use weights for certain purposes. But really, when I'm thinking about an athlete in front of me, I'm thinking about this particular stuff at the forefront. And then the weights are perhaps the stuff that's helping us to develop our hardware so that our software can be utilized to its greatest effect.
Cool, cool. So, what are some attractors like you feel like you constantly see in your patient or like your athletes? You need to like train it.
Yeah, so hip lock, I think, is obviously a really big one, particularly in soccer athletes, due to the nature of the sport and how much you're looking down at the ground. I do find, and even for myself, as I was growing up, a lot of the injuries that I realized were happening was because I wasn't getting into good hip lock positions to change direction. Getting into the running cycle at toe off, you see a lot of soccer players who have the outward knees and they don't know how to run really well. And that even links into swing leg retraction too. That's something that, again, due to the constraints of the sport, perhaps isn't being utilized as much. And really, all of them kind of link in your upper body first and your chest out when rotating. All of them, which we can talk about in a second, do feed into it. I think the for anybody who's starting out with this stuff, I would just keep it really simple and I would look at the main ones, I guess you can say. That might be controversial to say, but look at the main ones like your hip locks and your swing leg retraction and extended force closure, and you'll actually get a lot of benefit out of using those. But really, for me, I'm looking at a lot of different things because when we're trying to analyze somebody's movement, it's not like we can just say, yep, that's definitely what is wrong with this person. Sometimes you can, but a lot of the time you train these things and you enhance them and you realize that other things pop up in the movement pattern that might not have been there before. So really, it's quite layered. Hard to answer your question, I guess, but yeah, keep it simple, really.
Yeah. So, I know that as physical therapist, you must already learn movement assessment like FMS, SFMA, whatever it is. I used to use SFMA a lot, and while reading through the book, like probably the last time I read it, I feel like, oh, I finally get what he said. It's more like how people move in a chaotic situation and what should happen and what should not happen and how can we like kind of correct it? Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. I think with FMS in particular, that's something that as I was going through my training was a big one that got spoken about. And really, he talks about it as you mentioned. It can't be applied to field sport athletes because it is just too simplistic and linear and reductionist to be able to implement. Now, reductionism is not something that we should just totally chuck to the side. Again, I know Altus talks about it a little bit in some of their coursework, but really, reductionism can work very well for your general population, who might just have a really simple injury, and you can use some of the really simple stuff to fix it. But if you're getting somebody who's coming in with a adductor tendinopathy, for example, and they've tried all the different loading principles, your isometrics, your loading of your glute medius because it's apparently weak, all of those sorts of things they've tried to implement and they're still getting the pain. Well, then we need to look at what they're doing in their sport and realize that there are too many variables that make that small stuff not apply. So I know for the Solomons in particular, they were using some of the FMF stuff when I came in, and unfortunately, I didn't get too much of an opportunity to tinker it. It's hard when they were at the particular point in time that they were trying to qualify for the World Cup. But I could see that some of the injuries that were occurring for them were because they were utilizing these principles and they were far too simple to work when, say, they're versing Thailand, who are an excellent team. They have to move very quickly. They're so fast on the ball. How can you possibly say that FMS is going to work well in that particular environment? So I don't think we should discard it in total. It does work for certain people, but I don't think it works for athletes.
Nice, nice, nice. So, uh, I'm gonna dive into like some main attractors. Okay. So, all right, let's start from hip block. I'm trying to like because hip block get utilized a lot. Everybody focus on the hip block. I don't know why, but
Yeah.
like I was thinking about maybe start with something else, but yeah, probably just start with hip block. So, um, how does it work, and like why should hip move like that?
Yeah. So I suppose you're right. Hip lock gets talked about a lot, but it is very important, and we do see it in a lot of movement patterns. So I think that's the reason why people do utilize it quite a fair bit. And I've even used it very simply for back pain patients who are just general population, and it's worked really well. So I think it does have a very big universal applicability. But when we're talking about a hip lock and what it actually is, we're thinking about stability in all three of the planes. So the way that we achieve that is by having good contractions in all three of those planes with all the muscles around the hip that support those three planes of movement, co-contractions around the joint, but also how our pelvis is orientated when we're actually supposed to be in that position. So we're thinking that the free side of the pelvis is a little bit higher than the stance side, which helps to create that, I guess, co-contraction around the outside of the hip. We see the slight posterior tilt, if you will, of it to sort of help to lock it in, and then the free side starts to move forward a little bit more. And so that's what we're looking at when we're trying to assess a hip lock. In terms of your agility movements, it can also, I think, be in lateral movements as well. So we can't ignore that particular plane. You can actually create stability when you're trying to shuffle side to side as well.
Nice, nice. So, um, it's easy to understand. Like, I'm just gonna try to like summarize it. So the free side of the hip should be like elevated, and the side of the stance leg, you should like try to maximize squeeze your glute. All right. So it automatically create a plantar flexion on the stance leg, right? Yeah.
I think probably more so swing leg retraction does that. I do notice that a lot of athletes will actually keep in plantar grade when they're trying to perform this stuff. They often forget about plantar flexion. So one way that we can achieve this is by constraining what they're doing, right? It's hard and I know Bosch talks about this as well. It's hard for us to tell them what to feel and where to feel it. So we need to constrain what they're doing. And so to actually achieve that free side of the hip being higher, we might want to get them to drive their knee up higher by holding our hand and getting them to hit their knee into our hand as they're doing it. And if you tell them to, on the stance side with their arm, to reach up as high as they can and try and get as high up the wall if they're doing it against the wall, for example, that's probably going to promote the plantar flexion rather than just hip lock specifically.
All right. Cool. So, after hip lock, there's like swing leg retraction. I find this really confusing to me. Like, I thought came from a trap background. Swing leg retraction is kind of like B skip, kind of like switches. So, what can you like kind of explain it?
Yeah, so Bosch describes it or defines it, I guess, as a pre-flexion. So whip from the hip is a term that he uses, but really what we're getting is triple extension or extension of the hip in particular before we strike the ground. So in order for us to be able to hit the ground in the right way and actually keep the gait motion moving in the right direction, we obviously need to make sure that our leg is moving in that plane so that the resultant force is forwards. So it links a little bit into positive running. I think the easiest way to think about it is whip from the hip. So we cast our leg forward really far. And the reason why we do that, he calls it a phenomenon, which is interesting. But the reason why we cast our leg forward is to actually be able to initiate one hip lock on the stance side, which is obviously we can't forget about the other side. That's super important as we're going to toe off. And then as we leave toe off and go down to try and go into our striking of the ground in our stance phase, that's when our swing leg retraction happens. So we get that preflexion of, or the preflex of our posterior chain muscles. And if you think about it in that way, that really is essentially all it is.
Cool. So it's kind of like the scissor motion we want to see at sprinting or like change of direction, right?
Yeah, it's certainly a part of that, definitely. It gets enhanced, of course, by your B skips and your marches and all those sorts of things, of course. But yeah, I think in thinking about it as a preemptive hip extension is probably the best way. Yeah.
Yeah, nice, nice. So we got hip lock, we got swing leg retraction, and there's another retractor. Go with these two is foot plant from above.
Yeah. Yeah. So foot plant from above is really important. And it links in a little bit into swing leg retraction. If you don't have the swing leg retraction, you are going to struggle to perform foot plant from above really well. We can maybe talk about this at another point, how these attractors will influence each other positively or negatively and how they link in. But foot plant from above, the easiest way to think about it is that how your foot strikes the ground needs to be in the same vector as the ground reaction force. So if we're running and that's obviously a bit more vertical or slightly forward, we need to be making sure that, and you'll see this in sprinters, if you really slow them down, it almost looks like their foot as they cast it out and try to bring it back down again, it hovers almost. That would be an example of good foot plant from above, where they're actually applying that force in the same direction that the ground reaction force is. If we're thinking about it from a lateral movement, for example, and let's say I rapidly have to change direction to my right hand side, if it's not too fast and there isn't an overabundance of ground reaction force that I couldn't overcome with a triple extension of my stance leg, I need to make sure that if I'm heading kind of in this diagonal direction, that my foot plant and my triple extension of that leg is actually in that same angle that I'm trying to travel. If I do that, it limits the amount of torque moment that happens around the hip, especially, and means that I can actually share the load across the entire leg effectively. So, a very important one.
Yeah, that one's tricky. How do you know like you really did that? That one's kind of tricky.
Yeah, I suppose when you're looking at an athlete, videoing their movement can sometimes be useful. I know there's a bit of conjecture, I guess, about how much you engage the athlete in that because we're looking for that knowledge of results, not knowledge of performance. But for a coach in particular, I do use it a lot and find it really effective because sometimes it's hard to see in real time what's actually happening and analyzing stuff becomes difficult unless you are obviously at Bosch's level or Turn's level who are very, very proficient at it. So if I was to say, look at an athlete who is changing direction, I might film them do that. And then I can kind of draw out a line from the ground to their head, right? Or to their shoulder that they're changing direction from. If I have seen that the foot has not planted roughly in that same line of direction, I know that they've not foot planted from above really well. Same thing in the sprinting motion. I think, as I said, that the floating sort of foot is really, really relevant. In acceleration in particular, that's when you're probably seeing that they're applying the force in the direction, in the correct direction really, really well. In top flight, it might look a little bit different. We know that they're a little bit more upright now. They're heading a bit more in this direction rather than trying to actually get that horizontal moment and spend more time on the ground. So it might actually be that as they cast their leg forward and strike the ground, it's a little bit more in the downward direction. because we know that the body and the pelvis continues to transfer forwards as they keep running in that right direction. So the stance phase is going to naturally happen anyway. So we can hit the ground, you know, from an upward direction. I'd probably say if you're analyzing somebody in top flight, that's the loosely the easiest way to know if they're doing this or not.
Yeah, nice, nice. So like like these attractor kind of go with each other, like one happened, the other will happen. Is there like other attractor you find that um like it's like same is important as the others, but like get ignored a lot, or like anything specific you want to touch on?
Yeah, I suppose for people who are not extremely immersed in it, they might ignore foot plate from above. They might ignore upper body first and chest out when rotating. I'm not sure that they get it ignored, perhaps just not understood where they fit into the overall movement pattern. So I think it's important when you're analyzing movement to think about and it's contextual thinking, right? That's what he talks about. So we need to think contextually what needs to happen for this athlete in this particular scenario. So if I, for example, have an athlete who might be on running on the wing in soccer. They're still trying to head in that forward direction down the line, but they are looking over their shoulder to try and make sure that they can still watch the ball and know when to receive it or know when they might be offside. So many different variables, right? Chest out when rotating would become very important then because we need to make sure that they have maintained that forward orientation of the pelvis so that the gait cycle can still happen, but they're still looking over their shoulder in order to be able to actually see that the ball's coming. And we maintain the optimal length around the abdominals to do this, that sort of spiral action as well around the longitudinal axis. So perhaps somebody or a coach who doesn't do this stuff very often may only look at, well, okay, that person's not performing swing leg retraction really well, or their hip lock is pretty poor if I'm looking at them from the posterior view. So maybe I should just train that, and that might just solve all of their problems when they've totally disregarded the fact that this other action, which we know is super important for the orientation of the pelvis, is not actually happening. So I think my advice to anybody would be what all of the attractors are. Go through anatomy of agility. It's very important. I think know what they all are, perhaps how they interconnect and negatively, positively affect each other. You can kind of let that evolve over time because it's quite complicated. And I think the only way that you get better at that stuff is the more that you watch somebody, you go, okay, that makes sense. Why that's happening? I understand that now. But at least have an understanding and a list in your head about all of the possible ones and perhaps their definitions, for example, of what they are and what ones are there. And then that might help you to not miss something in your analysis.
Nice, nice. I want to mention the chest out when rotating and upper body first. Um at the first time I like go through the book the first time and the second time I go through the book, I feel like this is like basic sprint drills will do. Like track and field athlete done try to do this for decades. So it's like basic sprint drills. But like a few weeks ago, Noah Lyles physical therapist, Joe Brown, shout out to Joe Brown. So she was like giving a lecture to us about like the fascia thing. And at that time, it's like, hey, isn't like chest out and rotating and upper body first kind of like coincide with the function of posterior oblique sling? I'm like, yeah. So it actually makes sense to me. I don't know. Yeah. It just
Yeah,
yeah.
and even anatomy trains that sort of principle. I think it's Thomas Myers who wrote that. That stuff links in, right? We know that the body does work in slings. So I certainly would agree that this stuff applies, and this comes back to why we're caring so much about these particular postures that people are in is to reinforce those muscle coupling actions and making sure that they're functioning at the right times and actually working at all, because if we don't have a good posture around the abdominals, for example, then we know that the posterior sling might not work very well because our glute is not able to be in its optimal length to be able to perform. So definitely agree. And Bosch does talk about fascia, and we know the reason why fascia is important is because it actually allows us to transmit force across a joint and then obviously into other joints and muscles further down the chain as well. So I would agree. Certainly links in.
Nice, nice. And since you're a physical therapist, one thing I'm really interested, and I think I kind of asked like Dan to like talk a little bit, but like for the last few months, as I work with like more high level athletes, sprinters, jumpers, whatever it is, I also talk to a lot of like strength coaches and physical therapists. There's one thing I like, um co coaches kind of like debate about it is like the four bar system. Like you said, it's co-contraction for the hamstring and the what's the name of what's quad. Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, my English is bad. Um can you walk us like kind of walk us through what is four bar system and is it really like isometric? Because I know like uh the distal and the proximal are like different, right? They move different. So if you look at it one way, it's isometric. If you look at it the other way, some people will say it's eccentric.
Yeah, great question. It's a tough one. I know that there's a lot of people who really love your Nordic hamstring curls, for example. Bosch obviously doesn't. He loves the isometric state. The last time I looked at this, I think there was a bit of conjecture about, and even I think he mentions it in the book as well, whether this is actually the case or not. We're not 100% sure. That might have changed since I last read it. But either way, I do think that depending on how much of a change in angle there is, if it's a larger one, for example, then you perhaps might have more of an eccentric motion happening at the muscle. If there's a smaller one, then we probably know that it could be a little bit closer to what Bosch is talking about, where it's at an isometric state and the seriolactic components are the ones that are stretching more. Either way, I tend to with my athletes and even the Gen Pop people because in reality, they're probably exposed to a little bit more variability in the gym anyway. You get somebody who comes in who says, "Hey, I've injured my hamstring. I just want to be able to." But for your field sport athletes, I probably lean a bit more towards isometric state. And the reason that I do that is because isometric state tends to be, and if you get really strong isometrically, it tends to be how you can deal with much larger ground reaction forces and impinging forces anyway. So how that links into the four bar system, essentially the way that Bosch describes it is you have your two muscles on either side. Let's just take the thigh, for example. It's probably the easiest. You have your quad and your hamstring on either side of the thigh. And then obviously the quad attaches into the anterior portion of the knee and the hip, and the hamstring attaches onto the posterior portion of the knee and the hip. And so what he describes happening when we maybe change knee angles or hip ankles, because we ideally in sporting movements would like to see both of those happening at the same time. Otherwise, we might be a bit more predisposed to an ACL injury, for example, is that one move, they kind of move like this, right? They're sort of shuffling in this sort of way. And I like to think of it like a pulley system. So you pull on one side of the pulley system, the other one is going to move as a result. And that's because they're attached on either side of the joint. And so he describes that to be really important because that's how we develop those co-contractions around the hip and knee and the joint coupling as well. which is very important in deceleration, for example, when we're trying to slow down. We don't want to have a flexed hip and an extended knee because that's the risk of an ACL injury, or we don't want to have the opposite of that happening as well. So probably the easiest way to think about four bar system is like a pulley system. You have a certain direction of the ground reaction force on one side, and then the other acts as a result of that pulling on the opposite side. It's a bit complicated, and again goes back to your question about what I think about muscle activity. I don't know whether that was specifically what you were asking at the beginning, but I train both depending on who's in front of me. It really depends. Specificity again is another important principle. I'm trying to be specific with what that person needs to achieve.
Nice, nice. I feel like these kind of like the France boss system, like he mentioned in the book, like the research kind of used like reductionist approach. Am I using the word right? So you kind of like limit a lot of factors. Like you will probably need to deal with that in the real world. So that's why probably we mentioned that for like normal like gym pop, you would probably train eccentric. But if you're like more towards like athletes, you probably want to like train isometric because it really feel like it's you need to look at everything, right? And in depth.
Yeah, definitely. The reductionist view from this lens would perhaps be a little bit more relating to the research, I guess. We know that Nordic hamstring curls have, according to the research, reduced hamstring injuries in certain populations that they've been measuring. Now, we don't know, I guess, whether that's because their tissue quality and capacity improved, right? And that's the reason why they got better. It could even just be that it actually is eccentric muscle action that is super important in this particular lens. But we still have hamstring injuries happening really regularly in sport. We still have ACL injuries happening really regularly in sport. I don't think a lot of this stuff gets applied as much as it probably should. So we don't know whether if we were to adopt this approach more consistently, and I'm talking about the dynamic systems approach in particular, whether that would actually, across the board in the research, reduce these things from happening. So it is reductionist, I guess, because we're thinking linearly again. We're thinking that one thing that we do equals this, whereas we know that, well, an athlete's sleep might have an impact on their recovery and their injury rates, or their nutrition, or how they're moving, or how much training they've done this week, and the volume that they've accumulated might be too much more than what they actually have the capacity for. So I don't think that we can just look at, as you said, just look at the one thing and muscle activity and go, yep, that's it. That's all we need. And that's probably how I look at it the most. And another reason why I love dynamic systems as a physio is because we can, and even ecology too, we can look at even a general population athlete in front of us and go, well, yes, sure. This person has maybe done a little bit too much running than they previously were doing. They've jumped from doing 10Ks a week to 30Ks a week, and that might just be too much more than they could handle, and the reason why they're getting their pain. But also, they're having issues with their sleep, and they're stressed, and they're not eating very well. So there's so many different variables that you need to encompass, and that goes back to this very thing that you're talking about, is we can't think in a reductionist lens in these scenarios.
Nice, nice, nice. So yeah, for all those like I should probably start with this one. You mentioned like bottom up, and in the book it also talked about like top down. So we talked a lot about dynamic system theory. Can you like explain a little like what is top down, what is bottom up?
So top down is essentially this idea that the brain controls everything. It calculates every precise joint angle that you might be at, all of the degrees of freedom, when a muscle might switch on, when your Golgi tendon organ reflex is happening, all of those things. Whereas we know that if you needed to react to something very quickly, we know that the central nervous system's reaction times do not match what we need to react to in certain moments in general life, right? And the reason why we know that that doesn't work is because you can see these people do amazing things, and knowing that their central nervous system can't react that quickly, well, we have to think there must be something else that is going on in order to allow our bodies to do that and to react above our normal reaction time. And so that's where the bottom up principle comes into play, is that our muscles are essentially their own organs. They can they can react to the environment around them, change their properties, pre-tension, stabilize the joint on their own without our brain having to calculate that. So then what our brain can do is, if we're doing all of that really well, all of our bottom up is working the way that it should, our brain can try and perceive what's around us. Let's say again on a sporting field as the easiest example, I might be able to map out where I'm going to run in through these defenders because my brain is freed up to do that. And then if I get to that point and I have to react to a defender again, and again, my muscles are doing what they should do really well and acting as almost, their own entity, then I can react to different other things in the brain because I have that space freed up, and I don't have to try and think about those things as quickly. And as we mentioned, that can't happen anyway. So Bosch talks a lot about training bottom up, but when he mentions, I know in one of the books he has both of those things in like a diagram and sort of training both of them. That goes back to your hardware and your software. So in training with constraint-led approach, we would want to be making sure that our hardware can do what we need it to do, but that our software is also getting developed as well. So he believes in this idea of coordination training being very important to couple in with strength training for that very reason. Hope that
Nice,
answers the question. Bit
nice,
long-winded.
nice. I like it. I like it. I love it. So to me, I feel like it kind of like want us to train some sort of like spinal reflex. Is that a thing that is it like trainable?
Cool. So talking about spinal reflexes and training them in terms of how much I would do that as a therapist, I don't really focus on that element of it so much, mainly because they are built-in reflexes. One way that I might look at it instead would be if I'm getting them into these better body postures, I'm getting them into these attractor states more efficiently. I think that these reflexes have the ability to function and act much more efficiently and more often as well. And an example of that would be how hip lock and swing leg retraction couple in with each other. And we might look at that sort of reflex that happens as you go into hip flexion on one side, the stance side goes more into extension and thus a better hip lock. So yeah, keep it simple, I guess. That would be the my advice for therapists is look at it from that lens more so than specifically am I seeing this spinal reflex happen? It's hard to look at.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, for I think for coaches, you need to if you want to like for me, I want to ask understand this. I watch like tons of film, so you need to like really hone in, look at how their hip moves, how like the leg switches at certain time, where they land. It's really like I'm not gonna say if I said next level, some coaches gonna say not, but like. I mean, you really need to dive into like how they move on the field, right?
Yeah, and this is a key one, I guess, because a lot of what I've done with some of the field sport athletes who have come through the door in my clinic, because our clinic's a bit more of a boutique clinic, I guess, where we don't have access to a gym specifically, hopefully soon, but we don't have access to that or a field. So it becomes a little bit more challenging to actually analyze these things contextually, right? If anything, it's impossible to analyze it contextually. So I would actually endeavor to take those particular athletes out onto a field, constrain them in a way that sees whether they can deal with the constraints well and get into these attractor states well. And if they can't, then I'm trying to look for that gang leader that we're then going to go back into the clinic and train. And obviously, we do, as physical therapists or physios, all of our hands-on stuff that we think is relevant and important to be able to get into these postures. If you have too tight a hip flexor, then you're not going to be able to extend at the hip very well, right? So that's probably how I would look at it in that lens. But in terms of, yeah, analyzing that stuff from a physio's point of view, you've got to get out in the field and you've got to put the athlete through the things that they might be seeing in a game and looking at whether these attractors are actually happening or not. Because if they're not, then you need to be implementing interventions to try and train them for the athlete. You can't just do a little bit of hands-on work and say job done, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, the next question would be like, I know you kind of mentioned this earlier, but like, uh, mm, with all those attractor, I know some attractor go with each other, some attractor kind of like have conflict. How do we know like which go with which?
An easy way to look at that would be if I constrain one particular component of the movement, what happens? Another reason why I love a lot of this stuff is because it very much is trial and error, and you get to problem solve as a therapist. And that's kind of, if you're in this field for the right reasons, I think that's what you should really enjoy doing is trying to actively problem solve on the spot. So the easiest way to look at that would be to provide certain constraints for the person at certain parts of the movement and see, well, if I do this particular constraint, it may improve my upper body first, but it also might decrease my hip lock ability. And so you can then analyze that and go, okay, well, I might then want to reinforce the hip lock, for example, and see whether I can try and train that and then reassess again and couple in upper body first and that and see whether both of those two things have gone well together. So, yeah, trial and error. Basically, there's no cookie cutter approach here, unfortunately.
Nice, nice. That's basically all the question I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
To me specifically, I recently joined Instagram from a work point of view. So my handle is Sam underscore on the move, all one word. If you really want to ask any questions, especially as a coach or a therapist, I'd be more than happy to chat to people about it and try and develop this space. I guess you'll probably see if people start to follow me that this year I'll be posting a lot more about what I do specifically in this particular space. So you can follow that, but you can also go to the man himself and try and follow Franz and Tern Thomason and we mentioned before Harry Symington, all people who have kind of gone before us in that particular space and are implementing stuff really well. Even Lee Edgar and I'm forgetting the other guy now, but yeah, all of those people are great to try and follow. But yeah, if you're interested in how specifically I apply it in a physiotherapy lens, feel free to follow me and reach out and ask questions, and I'd be happy to engage with the audience and try and develop some people.